I watched the plow blade scrape across my property line at 4:17 inches the morning, dumping a wall of frozen slush onto land I'd measured down to the centimeter. By the time the sun came up, my tool shed was crushed under ice that had no business being there. The HOA president would later call it an accident. Tell me, weather doesn't respect boundaries. That I should be a better neighbor. But I'd spent 19 years in the Army as a land surveyor. I knew what a boundary looked like. I knew what deliberate looks like. And standing there in the cold with my coffee going lukewarm, I understood one thing clearly. They just crossed the wrong line. The cold hit differently at 6:0 inches the morning. Not the kind that makes you shiver and run inside, but the kind that sits in your lungs and reminds you that winter doesn't negotiate. I stood on my front porch with my thermos of black coffee, the same routine I'd kept for 8 years in this neighborhood, and looked out at what used to be clean property lines. The snow had stopped falling sometime around 3, leaving everything under a blanket of white that should have been peaceful. Should have been. Instead, there was a mound of ice and slush sitting 3 meters inside my fence line, right where it had no right to be. I didn't move. Didn't curse. I haven't pulled out my phone to call anyone yet. That's what 19 years in the Army teaches you. Observe first. React second. The tire tracks were clear as day, cutting from the HOA maintenance road straight across the boundary markers I'd set last fall. Deep treads, wide spacing, the kind you get from a commercial plow truck. And the snow itself wasn't the light powder that had been falling all night. This was road slush, the gray-brown mix of ice and salt and whatever chemicals the county uses to keep the streets clear. The HOA used a blue de-icer. I could see it in the melt pattern, that telltale tint that marked their work from 100 feet away. I took a sip of coffee and let the heat spread through my chest. My breath came out in clouds. Hanging in the air, like question marks, the shed. My small wooden storage shed, where I kept the lawn equipment and surveying tools, was listing to one side. Now, the back corner crushed under the weight of the dump. I built that shed 5 years ago. Got the permit from the HOA in writing. Submitted the plans. Waited for their approval. Did everything by the book. Now, it looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation. I walked down the steps, boots crunching through the fresh snow on my driveway, and stopped exactly at the property line. I didn't cross it. I didn't need to. I could see everything I needed from where I stood. The boundary markers were still there. Red top stakes I'd driven into the ground every 3 meters. Positioned with GPS accuracy down to 2 centimeters. They'd been there since I bought the place. Verified by the county surveyor. Documented in my closing papers. And the snow dump had landed well past them. A clear violation of the easement. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Wide shots first, showing the whole scene. Then close-ups of the tire tracks. The crushed shed. The boundary markers still standing like little red flags. I made sure the timestamp was visible on every shot. 4:17 M. The metadata would say, right when I heard the engine outside my window. I walked the perimeter once, checking every stake, planting one additional red flag, exactly where the tire tracks crossed onto my land. Then I went inside. My office was small but organized the way I liked it. Filing cabinets labeled by year and category, bookshelves arranged by subject, a desk clear of everything except my laptop and a single lamp. I opened the cabinet marked property and pulled out the survey file. Inside was everything. The official plat map from 2016 when I bought the house. The boundary verification I'd paid for out of pocket. The HOA covenant handbook, all 87 pages of it, and the correspondence I'd kept from every interaction with the homeowners association. I spread the plat map across my desk and compared it to the photos on my phone. The dump was 3 meters inside my line. No question. No ambiguity. Just a straight violation of Section 8. 2 of the covenant, which explicitly prohibited dumping waste materials on adjacent properties. I opened my laptop and drafted an email. Keep it short. Keep it factual. Attached 6 photos, each one labeled with GPS coordinates and timestamps. I wrote that I was documenting a boundary violation that occurred at approximately 4:15 a.m. on December 15th. That the snow and ice had been deliberately dumped on my property by what appeared to be an HOA contracted plow service, and that the dump had caused damage to my storage shed. I requested a formal response within 48 hours, including plans for removal and repair. I CC'd all 12 members of the HOA board. Then I called the main office number and left a voicemail with the same information. Noting that I was recording the call for my records, it was 7:30 by then. The office wouldn't open for another hour. I saved everything to a new folder labeled Evidence Snow Dumping and sat back. My jaw was tight. Not from anger. From focus. The sun was coming up now. A pale winter light turning the snow from gray to white. A few neighbors were starting their cars, scraping ice off windshields, getting ready for work. Mrs. Holloway from 2 houses down waved at me as she backed out of her driveway. I waved back. She'd lived here for 20 years. Long before the current HOA board took over. We'd talked a few times over coffee. And she'd mentioned how things had changed in the last 2 years. How the new president, Sloan Whitmore, had a different style. More corporate. More about control than community. I hadn't paid much attention then. I kept to myself, followed the rules, and stayed out of neighborhood politics. But standing there looking at the violation on my land, I started to understand what she'd meant. Power without accountability doesn't stay quiet for long. By 8:30, I'd sent a follow-up email to the HOA's contracted snow removal company, using the contact information from the decal I'd spotted on the plow truck in my driveway camera footage. I informed them that their vehicle had trespassed on private property and caused damage, and that I would be pursuing compensation. I kept a copy of everything. The emails, the photos, the recorded voicemail. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and waited. I didn't expect a quick response. I didn't expect an apology. What I expected was exactly what I got 3 days later. A template email from someone named Mara at the HOA office telling me that snow was a natural phenomenon, that the association couldn't be held responsible for where it ended up, and that I should consider being a more cooperative member of the community. I read the email twice. Then I opened the Covenant Handbook to page 47 and highlighted section 12.3, which stated in clear language that snow removed from common areas must be deposited within the boundaries of HOA-maintained land, not on private lots. I highlighted section 8.2, which prohibited the dumping of waste materials. And yes, Road slush mixed with chemical de-icer counted as waste onto neighboring properties, and I highlighted Section 15, 1, which gave homeowners the explicit right to file formal complaints about covenant violations and required the board to respond within 5 business days. I saved the document as a PDF, attached it to a reply email, and sent it back to Marlowe with a simple message. Please direct me to the board member responsible for covenant enforcement. I have documented violations that require formal review. Then I pulled on my coat and went back outside. The temperature had dropped again. My breath hung in the air like smoke. I stood at the property line, hands wrapped around the thermos, and looked at the red flag I'd planted earlier. It was still there, bright against the white snow, marking the place where someone had decided my boundaries didn't matter. Boundaries weren't just lines on a map. They were principles. They were the distance between respect and contempt. I'd already marked mine. Now we'd see who understood the difference. The response came on day 3, just as I'd expected. Not from the board, not from anyone with actual authority, just Mara, the office secretary, with an email so generic it might as well have been pulled from a template library. I read it standing in my kitchen, coffee going cold on the counter, and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger. Something colder than that. The email thanked me for my concern, acknowledged that winter weather presented challenges for the entire community, and reminded me that snow was a natural occurrence beyond the association's control. It suggested I review my homeowner's insurance for coverage of weather-related damage. It was signed with a digital signature that looked like it had been copied and pasted 1,000 times. Mara Vickers, Administrative Assistant, Ridgemont. HOA. I saved the email to my evidence folder and opened a new document. Started a timeline. December 15th. 4:17 a.m. Violation occurred. December 15th. 7:30 a.m. First contact via email and voicemail. December 18th. 2:15 p.m. Template response received. No acknowledgement of trespass or damage. I noted the 3-day gap. Note that the response didn't address a single point I'd raised. Didn't mention the tire tracks. Didn't mention the boundary markers. Didn't mention the covenant sections I'd cited. Just weather and insurance and community cooperation. I printed the email and filed it in a folder I labeled HOA Correspondence December. Then I picked up my phone and called the main office number again. Mara answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice had that practiced friendliness that customer service people develop. The kind that sounds warm until you realize it's just a wall. I identified myself and referenced my previous email. I asked to speak with someone from the board, specifically the member responsible for covenant enforcement. She put me on hold. The music was something instrumental and vaguely corporate, the kind designed not to offend anyone and therefore incapable of being remembered. When she came back, she told me the board reviewed complaints on a monthly basis and that my concern would be added to the agenda for the next meeting. I asked when that would be. She said January 10th. I asked if there was an emergency protocol for immediate violations. She said the board didn't consider this an emergency. I thanked her and ended the call. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't argue. I've just added another line to my timeline. December 18th, 2:30 p.m. Request for board contact denied. Redirected to monthly meeting 3 weeks away. I spent the next 2 days reading The Covenant, all 87 pages. I skimmed it when I bought the house, focusing on the sections about exterior modifications and landscaping, the things that seemed relevant at the time. But now, I went through it like I was studying enemy terrain. I highlighted every section that dealt with property rights, boundary enforcement, and complaint procedures. Section 8. 2 prohibited dumping waste on adjacent properties. Section 12. 3 required snow removal to stay within HOA-maintained boundaries. Section 15. 1 gave homeowners the right to file formal complaints and mandated a response within 5 business days, not 3 weeks. I made notes in the margins. Cross-reference sections. Built a map of where the rules said one thing and the board's actions said another. On the 4th day, I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of the HOA's incorporation documents and bylaws. Cost me $12 in printing fees. I took them home and read them at my kitchen table with a yellow highlighter and a notepad. The bylaws were clear. The board had a fiduciary duty to enforce the covenant equally across all properties. They couldn't selectively ignore violations. They couldn't delay responses beyond the time frame specified in Section 15. 1. And they definitely couldn't authorize contractors to trespass on private property. I found the clause about contractor liability and photographed it with my phone. Then I opened my laptop and started drafting a formal complaint letter, not an email this time. A physical letter sent via certified mail with signature confirmation, the kind that creates a paper trail nobody can ignore. The letter was 3 pages long. I laid out the facts in chronological order. The violation, the damage, my attempts to resolve the issue through normal channels, and the board's failure to respond within the required time frame. I cited specific covenant sections. I attached photographs, timestamp data, and a copy of my property survey. I requested 3 things: immediate removal of the dumped snow and ice, repair or compensation for the damage shed, and a written explanation of how the board intended to prevent future violations. I stated that if I didn't receive a substantive response within 7 business days, I would consider the matter unresolved and pursue alternative remedies. I didn't specify what those remedies were. I didn't need to. The threat of legal action works better when it's implied, not stated. I printed the letter, made 3 copies, and drove to the post office. Sent 1 to the HOA office, 1 to Sloan Whitmore, directly at the address listed on the incorporation documents, and 1 to myself for timestamping purposes. Total cost, $21.60. I kept the receipts. That evening, I met Mrs. Holloway at the coffee shop, 2 blocks from the neighborhood entrance. She'd suggested it after seeing me outside earlier and said she wanted to catch up. We sat in a corner booth with mugs of dark roast, and she asked how I was settling in. I told her about the snow dump. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. She said she wasn't surprised. She told me Sloan Whitmore had been board president for 2 years now. Ever since the previous president retired and moved to Florida, before Sloan, the board had been mostly retired, folks who treated the HOA like a social club. They enforced the big rules. No purple houses. No chain link fences. But they were flexible about the small stuff. Sloan was different. She'd been a marketing director for some hotel chain before moving here, and she ran the HOA the same way she'd run her corporate budgets. Strict policies. 0 exceptions. Everything about control and image. Mrs. Holloway told me about a family 3 streets over who'd painted their shutters a shade of gray that was half a tone off the approved color chart. Sloan had fined them $500 and demanded they repaint within 30 days. When they pushed back, she'd threatened to put a lien on their property. They repainted. She told me about another neighbor who'd planted a vegetable garden in their backyard, completely invisible from the street, and got cited for unapproved landscaping because someone had reported it during a board walkthrough. The fine was $200. The garden had to go. And when people tried to point out that the rules didn't explicitly prohibit vegetable gardens, Sloan would smile and say the covenant gave the board discretion to maintain community standards. That phrase, community standards, had become her favorite weapon. It meant whatever she wanted it to mean. I asked Mrs. Holloway if anyone had tried to challenge her. She said a few people had early on. One homeowner had hired a lawyer and threatened to sue over a fence dispute. Sloan had countered with the HOA's attorney, a firm that specialized in covenant enforcement and had deeper pockets than any individual homeowner could match. The case settled out of court. The homeowner paid $3, 0 inches legal fees, and took down the fence. After that, people stopped fighting. It was easier to comply than to spend money on lawyers and risk losing anyway. Mrs. Holloway said she'd learned to keep her head down, follow the rules to the letter, and avoid giving Sloan any reason to notice her. She'd seen what happened to people who pushed back. She didn't want that kind of trouble. I listened and didn't say much. Just sipped my coffee and filed every detail away in the back of my mind. When Mrs. Holloway asked what I was going to do, I told her I was still deciding. She looked at me for a long moment, then patted my hand and said to be careful. She said Sloan didn't like being challenged, especially not in public. She said the board had resources and time and a lawyer on retainer, and I should think hard before I started something I couldn't finish. I thanked her for the advice. I meant it. But sitting there in that coffee shop with the evening light fading outside and the smell of roasted beans filling the air, I already knew what I was going to do. I'd spent 19 years in the Army learning that rules only matter if they're enforced equally. I'd spent 8 years in this neighborhood following every rule they'd written, and now someone had crossed onto my land, damaged my property, and told me it didn't matter. That wasn't something you walked away from. That was something you documented, escalated, and resolved. By the time I got home, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped below 0. I stood on my porch for a moment, thermos in hand, and looked out at the boundary line. The red flag was still there, half buried in snow now, but still visible. The dumped ice had started to settle, compacting under its own weight, and the shed looked worse in the twilight than it had in daylight. I went inside and opened my laptop, checked the tracking number for the certified letters. All 3 showed as in transit, expected delivery in 2 business days. I updated my timeline with the coffee shop conversation, noting Mrs. Holloway's warnings about Sloan's history and the board's legal resources. Then I opened a new browser tab and started researching Maryland property law, specifically sections dealing with trespass, easement violations, and negligent damage caused by contractors acting on behalf of property owners. I read until midnight, took notes in a spiral notebook, the old-fashioned way, because sometimes writing things by hand helps you remember them better. By the time I closed the laptop, I had a clear picture of where I stood legally. The HOA didn't have the right to dump snow on my property. Their contractor didn't have immunity just because they were working for the association, and the board's failure to respond within the time frame specified in their own covenant created a documented pattern of negligence that would matter if this ever went to court. I didn't want it to go to court. Litigation was expensive and slow and unpredictable, but knowing I had that option, knowing the law was actually on my side, gave me something the board didn't expect me to have: leverage. I marked the notebook with the date and filed it in my evidence folder. Then I made one more entry in my timeline. December 20th, 11:45 p.m. Legal research completed. Case law documented. Foundation established. And then in smaller handwriting beneath that, they think I'll give up. They don't know. I was trained never to leave the ground. I've claimed. The certified letter came back, signed on December 23rd. I checked the tracking number online and saw Sloan Whitmore's signature scrolled across the delivery confirmation timestamped at 9:42 a.m. She'd received it. Read it, presumably. And by the end of business that day, I still hadn't heard anything back. No phone call. No email. No acknowledgement that the 7-day deadline I'd set was now ticking. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my coffee going cold and realized something important. They weren't going to respond until I made them. Words on paper didn't matter to people who were used to ignoring them. What mattered was evidence they couldn't dismiss and consequences they couldn't avoid. I spent the morning researching security cameras. Not the cheap motion-activated doorbells everyone had now, but real surveillance systems with 4K resolution, night vision, and weatherproof housing rated for sub-zero temperatures. I needed cameras that could capture license plates from 50 feet away in the dark. Cameras that timestamped every frame with GPS coordinates. Cameras that uploaded footage to cloud storage automatically so nobody could claim the recordings had been tampered with. I found a system that fit those specs. Read through 24 reviews. And ordered 3 units with next day shipping. Total cost $840. I added the receipt to my evidence folder under the category Preventive Measures and made a note that if this ever went to litigation, these cameras were a direct result of the HOA's failure to address the initial violation. The cameras arrived on Christmas Eve. I spent the afternoon installing them while the neighborhood was quiet. Most people inside with their families. The first camera went on the corner of my front porch, angled to cover the entire boundary line from the street to the back fence. The second went above my garage door, facing the driveway and the HOA maintenance road where the plow truck had entered. The third went on the back corner of my house, covering the rear property line in case they decided to dump snow from a different direction next time. I mounted each one according to the manual's specifications, adjusted the angles with a level to make sure the footage would be clean, and tested the night vision by shining a flashlight at the lens and watching the feed on my phone. Everything worked. Everything recorded. I labeled each camera in the app: front boundary, driveway access, rear perimeter. Then I enabled the cloud backup feature and set the system to save footage for 90 days. When I finished, I stood in my driveway and looked up at the 3 lenses pointed outward like sentries. Anyone coming onto my property now would be recorded from multiple angles with timestamps they couldn't dispute and image quality they couldn't blur. It wasn't about catching them in the act anymore. It was about making sure that when they acted again, and I was certain they would, there would be no ambiguity about what had happened. No room for excuses about accidents or natural weather patterns. Just video evidence of deliberate trespass saved to a server they couldn't access and couldn't erase. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the camera setup, then added it to my evidence folder with a caption. Security system installed December 24th, necessitated by HOA's refusal to prevent repeat violations. That evening, I called the lawyer Mrs. Holloway had mentioned in passing, the one who'd represented the homeowner in the fence dispute. Her name was on the County Bar Association website. A solo practitioner who specialized in real estate and property disputes. Her voicemail said she was out of the office until January 2nd, but would return calls in the order they were received. I left a message with my name and number and a brief summary. Boundary violation by HOA contractor. Documented damage. Failed attempts to resolve through internal channels. Seeking consultation on property rights and potential remedies. I kept it under 60 seconds. Lawyers billed by the hour. Even phone calls cost money. I hung up and added another line to my timeline. December 24th, 6:15 p.m. Legal consultation requested. Awaiting call back. On December 26th, I received another email from the HOA office. This one wasn't from the secretary. It was from Sloan Whitmore, directly sent at 7:30 inches the morning, like she drafted it before most people were awake. The subject line read, Your recent correspondence. I opened it and read through it twice, noting the tone shift from Mara's template friendliness to something sharper and more calculated. Sloan thanked me for bringing my concerns to the board's attention. She acknowledged that snow removal was a complex logistical challenge during heavy weather events. She noted that the contracted plow service operated under time constraints and that minor boundary discrepancies were unfortunately inevitable given the volume of snow and the urgency of keeping roads clear. She expressed regret about the damage to my shed and suggested I submit a claim to the HOA's general liability insurance, which she was confident would handle the matter appropriately. The email ended with a paragraph that made my jaw tighten. She wrote that while she appreciated my attention to property lines, the association expected all homeowners to approach neighborhood issues with a spirit of cooperation and understanding. She reminded me that we all lived in a community, and that communities function best when residents prioritized collective well-being over individual grievances. She hoped I would consider this perspective moving forward. It was signed with her full title. Sloan Whitmore, President. Ridgemont Homeowners Association Board of Directors. I saved the email and read it a third time. This time, highlighting specific phrases. Minor boundary discrepancies. Inevitable. Spirit of cooperation. Collective well-being over individual grievances. Every phrase was carefully chosen to reframe the violation as something trivial. Something I was overreacting to. Something that made me the problem instead of the solution. I opened a reply and started typing. I kept my tone professional. Thanked her for the response. Noted that the boundary discrepancy was not minor, but rather 3 meters inside my property line, documented with GPS precision, and visible in time-stamped photographs. Pointed out that Section 12, 3 of the covenant explicitly prohibited dumping snow from common areas onto private lots, meaning the violation wasn't inevitable, but rather preventable with proper contractor oversight. Stated that I would be happy to submit an insurance claim once the board provided me with the policy number and claims contact information, as that information was not included in her email. And then I added a final paragraph, worded carefully. I wrote that I shared her commitment to community cooperation and that I believed the best way to maintain that cooperation was through consistent enforcement of the rules we had all agreed to follow. I noted that selective enforcement undermined trust and created the appearance of favoritism. I expressed confidence that the board would handle this matter in accordance with the covenant's stated procedures. I CC'd the entire board again and sent it. 3 days later, the lawyer called back. Her voice was direct. No nonsense. The kind that made you think she didn't waste time on small talk. She'd reviewed my voicemail and wanted to know more details. I walked her through the timeline. The initial dump. The damage. The failed attempts to get a response. The vague insurance suggestion from the board president. I sent her the photos. The survey documents. And the email chain while we were still on the phone. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she asked if I had video of the actual dumping. I told her no, not of the first incident, but that I'd installed cameras to capture any future violations. She made a sound that might have been approved. She said property rights cases were straightforward when you had documentation. And I clearly understood how to build a file. She said the HOA's response was classic deflection. Acknowledge just enough to seem responsive, but avoid any admission of liability or commitment to corrective action. She told me I had 3 options. First, I could file a claim with their insurance and hope it got processed without a fight. Second, I could file a formal complaint with the county zoning board, which had oversight authority over HOA covenant enforcement. Third, I could pursue civil litigation for trespass and property damage. She said the first option was cheapest but slowest and gave the HOA control over the outcome. The second option was faster and put pressure on the board through an external authority. The third option was the nuclear choice. Expensive, time-consuming, but guaranteed to get their attention. She recommended starting with option 2 and keeping option 3 in reserve. She said her consultation fee was $300, and if I wanted her to draft a formal complaint to the county, that would run another $500. I thanked her and told her I'd think about it. She said to call her if anything else happened. Then she added something I didn't expect. She said boards like this one operated on the assumption that homeowners would give up before spending real money on lawyers. She said the fact that I documented everything and called her at all meant I wasn't the kind of person they were used to dealing with. She said that made me either very determined or very stubborn. And in her experience, those 2 things tended to produce the same result. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the numbers I'd written in my notebook. 840 for cameras, 300 for the consultation, 500 more if I wanted the formal complaint drafted. Add in the certified mail, the printing fees, the gas for trips to the courthouse. I was already over $1. 500 into this. And I hadn't even gotten to the repair cost for the shed yet. A rational person might have walked away, might have filed the insurance claim and hoped for the best, might have decided that a crushed storage shed wasn't worth the money or the stress or the fight. But I'd spent 19 years learning that walking away from a violation just taught people they could violate you again. I'd spent 8 years in this neighborhood following every rule they'd written, paying every fee they charged, keeping my property exactly the way the covenant required. And when I'd needed them to follow their own rules, they'd ignored me, deflected responsibility, and suggested I was the one being unreasonable. I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet, labeled it Financial Impact, started entering line items, camera system, legal consultation, certified mail, courthouse fees, future repair estimates, Added a column for potential recovery through insurance or litigation. Added another column for likelihood of recovery based on the lawyer's assessment. Then I saved the file and added it to my evidence folder. Not because I needed to justify the expense to anyone else, but because I needed to see it clearly for myself. This wasn't about $800 or a broken shed or even the dumped snow anymore. This was about whether the rules meant anything, whether boundaries meant anything, whether I was going to let someone with a title and a lawyer on retainer tell me that my property rights were negotiable. I already knew the answer. I'd known it since the morning I stood on my porch and watched the sun come up over a violation they thought I'd ignore. Now I just had to make sure they knew it. 2. The second storm hit 3 weeks later on January 9th. The forecast had been calling for it since the weekend. A nor'aster tracking up the coast. Expected to drop anywhere from 30 to 40 centimeters of heavy wet snow across the region. I'd watched the updates on my phone throughout the day, tracking the system as it moved inland. And by midnight, the first flakes were falling. I went to bed around 1 a.m. with the sound of wind rattling the windows, and woke up at 4:30 to silence. The kind of silence that only comes after heavy snow when the world is buried under a blanket thick enough to muffle everything. I got up, made coffee, and checked the camera feeds on my phone before I even looked outside. The timestamp read 4:17 a.m. I watched the playback in real time, my thumb pausing the video every few seconds to make sure I was seeing it correctly. The plow truck came in from the HOA maintenance road, headlights cutting through the snow, and stopped at the edge of my property. The driver didn't hesitate, didn't check his position or consult a map. He just lowered the blade, angled it toward my land, and pushed. The snow came off the road in a gray wave, tumbling over the boundary markers I'd planted, burying them under half a meter of slush and ice. And then he backed up and did it again. 3 passes total. Methodical, deliberate. By the time he finished and drove away, there was a wall of compacted snow sitting on my property and my storage shed. The one I'd rebuilt after the first incident was leaning at an angle that meant the frame had cracked. I didn't go outside right away, didn't rush to inspect the damage or start taking photos. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand and watched the footage 4 more times, noting every detail. The truck's license plate was visible in 2 of the camera angles. The driver's face was clear enough to identify the cab lights. The timestamp was synchronized across all 3 cameras, confirming the exact sequence of events. And most importantly, the video showed the driver looking directly at my property before he started pushing snow. Not a glance, a deliberate look, like he was confirming his target. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't weather. This was intentional. And now I had proof that would hold up in any proceeding that mattered. I saved the footage to 3 separate locations: the camera's cloud storage, an external hard drive, and a private folder on my laptop. Then I downloaded the files and burned them to a disk, old school backup in case the digital copies somehow disappeared. I labeled everything with the date and time and filed the disk in my evidence folder. Only then did I pull on my boots and coat and go outside. The temperature was somewhere around -15, cold enough that my breath froze in the air and my fingers went numb inside my gloves within 30 seconds. The shed was worse than it looked on camera. The back wall had collapsed completely this time, crushed under the weight of snow that had been dumped with enough force to snap the support beams. Tools were scattered across the ground, some of them bent, others buried. I've built that shed twice now, permitted it, inspected it, maintained it exactly according to code, and now it was rubble. I took photographs from every angle, wide shots and close-ups, making sure the boundary markers were visible in the frame. Then I measured the distance from the snow dump to the property line with a tape measure, recording it in my notebook. 8 meters inside my land, consistent with the previous violation. I photographed the tire tracks and the fresh snow, clear as day, leading from the HOA road directly onto my property. I photographed the crushed shed, the broken tools, the compacted ice that would take weeks to melt, even if the temperature climbed above freezing. And then I went back inside, pulled up the non-emergency police line on my phone, and made the call. The dispatcher asked if anyone was injured. I said no. She asked if there was immediate danger. I said no. She said an officer would be out within the hour to take a report. I thanked her and hung up. The officer arrived at 6:45. A younger guy with the patient expression of someone who'd already handled a dozen weather-related calls that morning. I walked him through what had happened, showed him the video footage on my laptop, and took him outside to look at the damage. He wrote everything down in a notepad, took his own photos with a department-issued camera, and gave me a case number for the incident report. He said this looked like a civil property dispute and suggested I contact a lawyer. I told him I already had. He nodded and said the report would be filed as destruction of property and that I could request a copy for insurance or legal purposes within 5 business days. I thanked him. He looked at the shed one more time, shook his head, and said he hoped I got it sorted out. Then he got back in his patrol car and left. Tire tracks cutting fresh lines through the snow on my driveway. By 8 a.m., I was standing in the HOA office lobby. The building was a small converted house at the neighborhood entrance, painted the same beige as every other structure the association controlled. The secretary looked up when I walked in, and I saw the recognition in her eyes before she said anything. I told her I needed to speak with someone from the board immediately. She said the office didn't open for scheduled appointments until 9. I said this wasn't an appointment. This was an emergency related to repeated property violations. She picked up her phone, dialed an extension, and spoke quietly for a moment. Then she hung up and told me to wait. I sat in one of the chairs by the window and didn't say anything else. 5 minutes later, the door to the back office opened and Sloan Whitmore walked out, followed by 2 other board members I recognized from the incorporation documents. Sloan's expression was somewhere between annoyed and controlled. The look of someone who didn't appreciate being pulled into the office early, but wasn't going to show it. She asked what the emergency was. I pulled out my phone and played the video without preamble, holding it so all 3 of them could see. The footage ran for 90 seconds. The truck arriving, the driver looking at my property, the snow being pushed deliberately across the boundary line. When it finished, I lowered the phone and waited. One of the board members, a man in his 60 seconds with gray hair and reading glasses, cleared his throat and said it looked like the driver might have misjudged the angle in the dark. Sloan said the crew was under pressure to clear the roads quickly during heavy snow events. I asked if they were claiming this was another accident. The third board member, a woman in her 50 seconds, didn't say anything at all. I pulled a printed copy of the incident report from my jacket and set it on the desk between us. Told them the police had classified this as destruction of property. told them I had time-stamped video evidence from 3 angles showing deliberate trespass. Told them this was the second time their contractor had violated my boundary and caused damage, and that the covenant they were supposed to enforce explicitly prohibited this exact behavior. I kept my voice level. Didn't raise it. I didn't need to. Sloane's jaw tightened, and she said the board would look into the matter and discuss potential remedies at the next meeting. I asked when that was. She said January 10th. I pointed out that it was tomorrow, and that Section 15, one of the covenant, required a response within 5 business days of a formal complaint. Not 3 weeks. She said the board had already scheduled a full agenda and couldn't accommodate last-minute additions. I told her this wasn't a last-minute addition. This was the same issue I'd raised in December, the one they'd ignored until it happened again. I told her I had documentation going back 4 weeks showing their failure to respond, their refusal to enforce their own rules, and their contractor's pattern of deliberate violations. I told her I'd consulted with a lawyer who confirmed I had grounds for civil action, and that I was giving them one final opportunity to resolve this internally before I escalated it externally. The room went quiet. Sloane's expression shifted from controlled annoyance to something harder. She said if I insisted on making threats, the board would have no choice but to respond through their legal counsel. She said the association had resources I couldn't match, and that pursuing litigation would be expensive and unpleasant for everyone involved. She suggested I reconsider my approach. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up the incident report, put it back in my jacket, and told her I'd see her at the meeting tomorrow. I walked out before she could respond. The drive home took 3 minutes. I spent it replaying the conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every shift in tone. Sloane had made her position clear. She wasn't going to fix this voluntarily. She was going to fight it. Using the board's lawyer and the association's money, betting I'd run out of resources or patience before she did. What she didn't know was that I'd already committed to seeing this through. I'd already spent the money. I'd already built the case, and I had something she didn't. 19 years of training and how to hold ground once you'd claimed it. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment looking at the wreckage of my shed. Then I pulled out my phone and called the lawyer back. When she answered, I told her I wanted to move forward with option 2. She said she'd have the formal complaint to the county ready by the end of business. I thanked her and hung up. Then I went inside, opened my evidence folder, and started preparing for tomorrow's board meeting. They wanted a fight. They were about to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind they expected. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with anger. They're fought with patience, documentation, and the absolute refusal to accept that power trumps principle. At HOA Unfolded, we believe every boundary violated is a test, not of strength, but of resolve. Would you have walked away, or would you have stood your ground? The board meeting was scheduled for 700 p.m. on January 10th. I spent the day preparing. Not in the frantic way people do when they're nervous, but with the methodical precision I'd learned from years of military briefings. I printed copies of every document in my evidence folder. The survey maps, the covenant excerpts, the email chains, the incident reports, the time-stamped photographs, and stills from the video footage showing the plow driver's face and the truck's license plate. I organized them into folders, one for each board member, with tabs marking the key sections. I rehearsed my presentation in front of the bathroom mirror, timing myself to keep it under 5 minutes. Facts only. No emotion. No appeals to fairness or community spirit. Just documented violations and required remedies. The meeting was held in the same converted house where the HOA office operated, in a conference room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly washed out. I arrived 10 minutes early. The room was already half full with other homeowners, some there for their own agenda items, others just observing. I recognized a few faces from the neighborhood. Mrs. Holloway was sitting in the back row. She gave me a small nod when I walked in. I took a seat in the third row, set my folders on my lap, and waited. The board members filed in at 7 exactly, taking their seats at a long table at the front of the room. Sloan sat in the center, flanked by the 2 members I'd met yesterday, and 4 others I didn't recognize. She called the meeting to order with a voice that carried authority without being loud. The first 3 agenda items were routine: approval of last month's minutes, discussion of landscaping contracts for spring, and a vote on updated parking regulations. I listened without comment, watching how Sloan ran the meeting. She was efficient, moving through items quickly, cutting off discussion when it went too long. When she reached item 4 on the agenda, homeowner complaints and concerns, she looked directly at me and asked if I wanted to speak. I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and handed each board member a folder. Then I turned to face the audience and started talking. I laid out the timeline in chronological order. December 15th, first violation. January 9th, second violation. Both incidents were documented with photographs, video evidence, and police reports. Both incidents involved the same contractor, the same plow truck, and deliberate dumping of snow onto my property in direct violation of Covenant Sections 8, 2, and 12. 3. I pulled up the video on my laptop and projected it onto the wall using the room's display system. The footage played in silence. 90 seconds of clear evidence showing the driver looking at my property before pushing snow across the boundary line. When it finished, I pointed out the timestamp, the license plate, and the compacted ice wall that had crushed my shed. I noted that this was the second shed destroyed by the same behavior, and that I'd followed every internal procedure the covenant required. Filed complaints, requested remedies, waited for responses that never came. I stated that the board's failure to enforce its own rules had directly enabled the second violation, and that I was now requesting 3 things. First, immediate removal of the dumped snow at the association's expense. Second, full repair or replacement of my shed, compensated by the HOA or its contractor. Third, a written policy change ensuring contractors were trained on property boundaries and held accountable for violations. The room was quiet when I finished. Sloan leaned back in her chair and folded her hands on the table. She said the board appreciated my thoroughness, but that snow removal during emergency weather events involved difficult logistics and unavoidable margin of error. She said the contractor operated under time pressure and that expecting perfect accuracy in a blizzard was unrealistic. One of the other board members, the man with gray hair, added that the association's insurance would likely cover the shed damage if I filed a claim. I asked if he was acknowledging that the association was liable for the damage. He hesitated. Sloan cut in and said the board wasn't making any admissions of liability, only offering a path toward resolution. I asked what would prevent this from happening a third time. She said the board would discuss contractor oversight in executive session and make adjustments as needed. I looked at her for a long moment, then closed my laptop and picked up my folders. I thanked the board for their time and told them I'd be filing the insurance claim they'd suggested. Then I added one more thing. I said that if the snow wasn't removed from my property within 72 hours, I would remove it myself and deposit it in a location of my choosing within the boundaries of my own land in full compliance with county regulations. Sloane's expression shifted. She asked what I meant by that. I said exactly what I'd stated. I would exercise my property rights to manage snow on my own land since the association had demonstrated it couldn't be trusted to respect those boundaries. She started to respond, but I was already walking back to my seat. The murmur in the room told me people had understood the implication. Even if she hadn't yet, I left the meeting at 8:15 and drove home in silence. The streets were still lined with snow from the storm, pushed into narrow BMs that made every road feel smaller. When I got home, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in my driveway and looked at the wall of ice and slush still sitting on my property, 3 meters past the boundary line, exactly where it had been dumped 4 days ago. The cameras were recording. The evidence was documented. And now I had 72 hours to make good on what I'd said. I went into my garage and pulled the tarp off the small plow attachment I'd bought back in December, but the principle remained, and that was worth every dollar I'd spent, every hour I'd invested, every moment I'd stood my ground and refused to walk away. The last snow melted in mid-April. I watched it happen over the course of a week. The white giving way to brown grass and patches of mud, and then finally to the green that comes when winter releases its grip. The mornings were still cold enough that I kept my thermos routine, standing on the porch at 6 a.m. with black coffee and my breath visible in the air. But now the silence wasn't heavy with ice. It was light, open. The kind of quiet that comes before birds start singing and the neighborhood wakes up to a new season. I spent the first warm Saturday working on the boundary line. Not because there was a problem, not because anyone had violated it, but because it was time to turn the markers into something more permanent. I pulled up the red surveying stakes I'd driven into the ground 5 months earlier and replaced them with a line of tulip bulbs, planted every meter along the entire 30-meter stretch where the ice wall had stood. The bulbs were deep red, the kind that would bloom in late spring and come back every year. I dug each hole to the exact depth specified on the package, measured the spacing with a tape measure, and marked the positions in my notebook. It took most of the day. By the time I finished, my hands were covered in dirt, and my back was sore. But the line was planted. Mrs. Holloway stopped by while I was cleaning up. She brought homemade bread wrapped in cloth and said it was a thank you for everything I'd done over the winter. I invited her to sit on the porch, and we talked for a while about the new board, the changes in the neighborhood, the way people seemed more willing to speak up. Now, when something wasn't right, she said the advisory committee had started meeting monthly and that attendance was higher than it had been in years. She said people felt like their voices mattered again, like the HOA was actually working for them instead of the other way around. I told her that was how it should have been all along. She smiled and said, "Sometimes it takes someone willing to build a wall to remind everyone where the boundaries are." After she left, I walked the perimeter one more time, checking the tulip line and making sure the spacing was even. The shed stood solid in the backyard, rebuilt with materials better than the original. The cameras were still mounted on the corners of the house, still recording. Though I'd adjusted the retention settings to save footage for 30 days instead of 90, I didn't need as much storage now. I didn't need to document everything with the same intensity. The threat had passed. The system had corrected itself. But I kept the cameras anyway because vigilance doesn't end just because the immediate danger is gone. In early May, I saw Sloan Whitmore at the grocery store. It was the first time I'd seen her since her resignation. And the encounter was brief. She was in the produce section picking through apples. And I was walking past with my cart. Our eyes met for a second, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't expected. Not anger, not defiance. Just exhaustion. She looked smaller somehow. Like the weight of the past few months had compressed her. I nodded once. She hesitated, then nodded back. Neither of us spoke. I continued down the aisle, and when I glanced back a moment later, she was gone. I didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel vindicated. I just felt the quiet certainty that comes when something that needed to happen has happened, and now it's over. The tulips bloomed in late May. I walked outside one morning and saw the first buds opening bright red against the green grass, forming a perfect line along the boundary. Neighbors slowed down when they drove past, some of them stopping to comment on how nice it looked, how unusual it was to see flowers planted in such a precise row. I told them it was a property marker. Some of them understood immediately. Others just nodded and said it was beautiful. Both responses were true. By early June, the entire line was in full bloom. A living boundary that anyone could see from the street. One evening, a young couple from 3 streets knocked on my door. They introduced themselves and said they'd moved in over the winter, right around the time the ice wall incident was happening. They'd followed the story online and wanted to thank me in person. The husband said they'd been dealing with their own HOA issue, a dispute over a fence installation, and that watching how I'd handled my situation had given them the courage to push back. They documented everything, filed formal complaints, and eventually gotten the board to approve their fence. He said they wouldn't have known to do that if they hadn't seen how I'd approached the problem. I told them documentation was everything. The wife asked if I had any advice for dealing with difficult boards. I said the same thing I'd told everyone who'd asked. Know your rights. Keep records. And don't back down when you're right. They thanked me again and left. I stood on the porch after they were gone, looking out at the neighborhood in the fading light. The tulips were still visible along the boundary line. Bright spots of color in the dimming evening. The cameras recorded me standing there. The same position I'd been in dozens of times over the past 6 months. But the context had changed. The weight was different. There was no violation to document, no fight to prepare for. Just a quiet evening in late spring, and a line of flowers marking the place where I'd refused to let someone take what was mine. I thought about the wall, about the ice and the effort, and the night spent building something that would only last until the temperature rose. It had served its purpose. It had made a point that words couldn't make. It had forced a reckoning that politeness wouldn't have achieved. And now it was gone, melted into memory, replaced by something that would grow and return every year. The boundary wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a garden. And standing there in the cool evening air, I realized that was exactly what I'd been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not victory, just the right to live on my own land, under my own terms. With the rules applied fairly and the lines respected, the fight was over. Spring has come, and the boundary held.